Hello and welcome to the EstimatorXpress Software Skills course Module 2. In this module we will be looking at the specifications and showing you how you can modify them within EstimatorXpress, and we will also be looking at a couple of other parts of the settings section where you can further customize EstimatorXpress to suit your own needs. Right, so to start off with, looking at the EstimatorXpress main menu, we need to click on the button that says My Settings. And today we're going to start off by clicking on My Specifications. Okay, by default EstimatorXpress comes supplied with 8 specifications. So the first thing we're going to do is have to chat through the differences between these specifications. So the first one you can see here is the new build specification. Now this is fairly well defunct now because the new build specification is for houses which went through planning and building control prior to the building regulation changes in 2014. So there will still be a few jobs out there where this spec is relevant. However, the vast majority of new builds now will be following the new Part L regulations, so we'll no longer be using this specification, but we've left it in the software for reference. The next specification is the extension specification. Now this is current for current building regs for extensions. The main difference between the extension spec and one of the new build specs is that it has slightly slower construction times to allow for the fact that when you're building an extension you're working on an existing property where you probably have to take care, and it also does things like it makes use of a mini digger instead of a JCB by default, making the assumption that you can probably get a mini digger on site but you probably can't get a JCB on site, especially if it's an example of an extension in somebody's back garden. The renovation specification, this is similar to the extension spec. It makes use of a mini digger again, and it has yet further time increases for certain tasks to allow for the fact that a renovation could be more complex again, and there's a greater possibility of coming across unforeseen circumstances which may slow down the job. Now the fourth and fifth specifications here, we'll talk about these together. These are timber frame specifications, and these two here are now applicable only for extension or renovation jobs really. You'll see that below there are some Part L timber frame specs. Those are for new builds, so referring to what I was mentioning before about changing regulations. But there are still quite a lot of jobs which are timber frame, but they're an extension, so they don't require the new Part L regulations. So the timber frame specification, what this will do is remove the construction costs of all inner leafs for external cavity block walls, and it will also remove the construction cost of the roof structure. When I say the construction cost, it will remove the materials. For example, with a timber frame build, you may have a kit being supplied to the property which consists of all the inner leaf and the roof structure. This means that you would still estimate the property as usual by using, for example, a cavity block wall. But what would happen is that the specification would then nullify the inner leaf costings because you've taken account for that elsewhere by putting in a price for a timber frame kit, and the same for the roof. The site fab timber frame spec works in a similar fashion, but that only removes the inner leaf. With the site fab timber frame, the assumption is you will be costing a traditional cut or truss roof. There's also an option when you're using these to put in your own prices for timber frame panels if you're going to build them yourself, or you could put in a subcontractor fee if they are being supplied. The new build Part L spec, as it says on the tin, this is the current building regs specification for new builds, so 99% of estimates you'll be doing now should be using this specification if you are estimating a standard new build. As I mentioned before, this has the fastest build times and it defaults to using a JCB as opposed to a mini digger. And the bottom two specs are the two timber frame specs with the Part L adjustments. So you would use these two if you're doing a new build in timber frame. Okay, so now we've gone through the basics of what types of job the different specifications cover, we need to explain what they do. The specifications are a bit like an architect's spec, a list of materials, and in our case also labourers and plant, that are chosen for a job by default. The idea of having these in the software is you can customize them to use your choice of products for particular tasks. You can alter the supplied specifications, or you can copy them and make your own, and you can make as many as you like. So some typical examples of reasons for having your own or modifying specifications. Number one, you may do regular work for a particular architect, and that architect will always specify a certain type of timber in the roof, for example. So what you could do is make a copy of, let's say, the new build or the new build Part L spec, call it new build Part L spec, particular architect's name, and then in there you can change all the timbers over to the different timber products that the architect always likes to specify. Then when you're doing an estimate for this architect, you would use that specification at the start of creating the estimate, therefore have it automatically selecting the correct timbers to match the way that architect works. Another example could be that you always like to use a particular type of block. So you could either modify or again copy one of our specifications that's suitable for a job and change the default block. That way whenever you start an estimate, it will always automatically use the type of block that you want for all your block work. Some people also make copies of the specifications where they work in a particular area, where there are some common differences to the default specs. So if you are building in a certain way to make sure that the property is in keeping with the local area, you can set up a specification that actually matches an area. You would do this if you do repeated jobs in the area. There's no point in creating a big custom specification if you're only going to use it once. The idea is that if you are going to use this again and again and again, then create a specification with custom changes, which then means that the next time you come across a job of that nature, you've already done the work. That will then save you time and increase your accuracy. Okay, so that's a lot of theory. So what we want to do now is have a look at a specification in more detail. So what we're going to do is we're going to create our own specification, which means we can do some editing, and it won't affect any of our real specifications. So to start off, click on the extension specification, and then click on Copy Spec. You can do this on the top menu, or you can right-click and do Copy Spec. You'll then be asked to give the specification a name. Make sure this is something that is meaningful. I'm going to call mine Ed's Extension Spec. Now you can see your specification. So let's have a quick chat about what you can see on the screen. You'll see that there's several columns. The first column talks about the item used for, so this is the task that is being talked about. This is mostly material and labour tasks, and there's also some plant tasks in there. So we'll see that we have material to start off with, then we have labour tasks, and then we have plant. And this is split up into small sections. So there is a cavity wall specification, so that all the cavity wall workbooks will start off by talking to this specification. Then further down there'll be some slightly more workbook specific lines. For example, the stone face cavity wall specification will predominantly make use of the first section we looked at a moment ago, but further down it will have something specific such as the stone facing. If you scroll down the list further, you'll then see that there's a cavity block wall specification. This is for internal walls. Various ICF and SIPS wall specifications, retaining walls, etc. And then we come down to the tiled roof general specification. So this specification here will control the materials and labour for all sloping roof workbooks. So for example, if we changed the default tile, all the sloping roof workbooks, which are about 6 or 7 of them, would then use the different default tile. This is far more efficient than changing the tile in 5 or 6 different workbooks. And the specification is enormous. We've only just started on the top of it. It's several thousand lines long. and it controls every single specification linked workbook. So going back up to the top, you'll see that the second column then contains a description of the product or the labourer being used, and if you look further across, which specifies the build phase, which is what section of the quote this line will go into, and then usage units, type of product, and your supplier. Right, so there are two aspects on how you can change your main specification. You can select a different material or labourer or plant for a task, or you could alter how much a material or how long a labourer takes or how long a plant is used for a task. Okay, so the two differences there are you can change a resource to something different, or you can edit the existing resource to be used a different way. So firstly, let's look at changing a material. So if you'd like to click on the line that says cavity insulation, and it doesn't matter where you click on that line as long as it is somewhere on the cavity insulation line, we can see that the task is a material task of cavity insulation, and that the resource selected is cavity wall insulation 100 by 455 by 1200mm sheets, and it's a 5.46 metre square pack. To change this, we go on the top menu and click Change Resource, or we can right click to do Change Resource. And this now opens up the price book. Because the existing product was an insulation product, it's opened us up in the insulation section within our price book, which is very handy. I want to choose a Celotex style product. Now, because you may or may not have a Jewson link in your software, I'm not actually going to choose Celotex because that's a branded download from Jewson. So I'm going to look down my list for polyiso cyanurate insulation board. That's the unbranded HPXL price tracker name for insulations such as Celotex and Kingspan. And I want to change my insulation for a 2400 by 1200 by 75mm polyiso cyanurate insulation board. So I will click on that line, and I will then click on Select Resource on the top menu, or once again I can right click and do Select Resource. You will now be presented with the Edit Resource box. The reason for this is that when we've chosen a different product, we need to check the usage factor, which describes how much of a product is used for a task. Now initially, you'll see here we have a usage factor number of 0.183. That probably doesn't mean very much. So to see what that means in English, we click on the calculator. We're now presented with the usage factor calculation screen. So to start off with, it says that I use one polyiso board for 5.46 square meters of cavity insulation. Now that was a usage factor for the original product that we had on the cavity insulation. If you remember, it was one of our standard insulation packs, which is 10 sheets, which covers 5.46 square meters altogether. Now hopefully you all know this dimension. Any 2400 by 1200 board always covers 2.88 square meters. So we need to change the usage factor to say that I'm going to use one of these boards to cover 2.88 meters squared of cavity insulation. If I want to, I can also tick Include Wastage. Once I'm happy with that, click OK. You can see that our usage factor number has now changed, and we can click OK again. This now returns us to the specification, and let's see that we now have a change of product. Now, whenever you do change a material in particular, one of the things you need to bear in mind is, does that new material get installed, fixed, built, etc. at the same speed as the other material? Now, in the case of switching from the good old cavity wall slabs to polyiso Celotex board, should we call it, it's a lot slower to install this, which is good because that now means we've got an opportunity to do the other function which we do in the specification, which is to edit a resource to alter its usage. So we've changed resource to choose a different insulation product. Now we want to edit the labourer because we've got a new insulation product and it takes a lot longer to install. So as I mentioned earlier, most material tasks have a corresponding labour task. So if we scroll down, we will see that there is a line which talks about installing the insulation. And it says here, fix cavity insulation. So once you've found that, we want to click on Edit Resource, or you can do right click again. This takes us straight to the Edit Resource box with our usage factor calculator. So we're going to click on the usage factor calculator because 0.036 doesn't really mean anything to us. And in here it says it takes 1 hour to do 27 meters squared of fixed cavity insulation. For simplicity's purposes, I'm going to say that it takes twice as long to install the Celotex as it does to install the old type insulation. So the easiest way to change this is for I just go up here and change the 1 to a 2 to say it takes 2 hours to fit 27 meters, thus doubling the duration of my insulation fixing. Click OK and click OK again. Okay, for practice, let's do another resource. This time we're going to change the usage of a material to make it use twice as much. So you want to look for a line that is plastering to inner block wall. So this is a material task, which is this line here. And what we're going to do is have the effect of fitting 2 layers of plasterboard. This is something we get asked about quite a lot. In certain circumstances, people like to double up on the plasterboard, I assume for soundproofing purposes. You can also do this if you're plastering over steels and you want to do added protection. So again, we're going to edit the resource. I'm going to click straight on the usage factor calculator. In here, you will say that I use 1 plasterboard sheet for 2.8 square meters. So there are 2 ways of editing this. I could either divide this figure by 2 and say that I use 1 for 1.428 or do some complicated maths, or much easier, I could just say that I'm going to use 2 sheets to cover the same area. That will double the amount of plasterboard that is being used. Once I put that in, click OK, and then click OK again. So you've now configured this specification to fit 2 layers of plasterboard on the inside of all cavity walls. What we could also do now is go and edit the labour resource for fitting plaster to make it take slightly longer to do so. If you scroll down again for the line which is fix or apply plastering to walls, just here, you see this is a labour task. Again, we can do edit resource, click on the calculator. I'm not going to say it takes twice as long. I'm going to say that instead of taking an hour to fit 9 square meters, I'm going to say it takes 1.5 hours to fit 9 square meters. So we've made it take half as long again. Once you type that figure in, click OK, and then click OK again. This is obviously just for practice purposes, so don't worry if these figures aren't real. It's just for understanding the principle. So before we have a look at mini specifications, just a few other things to mention. You'll see that certain items are in bold red. This is just a marker. There's a button on the top here called markers, which allows you to set a resource as a critical. So certain items we have defaulted to critical. It is a matter of opinion as to what is or is not critical, and there's some items on here which some people think should be critical and aren't, and vice versa. If you want to, you can change them around. Other than that, it has no significance. It's not an alert saying there's something wrong. It just says that this is what we believe to be a critical item. One more quick mention. When you click on Change Resource and the price book opens up like this, you will notice on the right hand side there is an X to close down the price book. Do not click on this close. What that will do is close the software down. If you've clicked on Change Resource and it's popped up the price book and you think, actually I don't want to be here, use the cancel that is on the menu up here in the top left hand corner. Okay, so that's the main specification section covered, but before we leave the screen, we're going to have a quick look at the mini specs, which is a new feature in EstimatorXpress. Now you'll see here on the top menu in a specification there's an option that talks about creating or editing mini specs. I'm just going to show you these, so you don't really need to bother playing about with these for the time being. There is a separate video that goes into a lot more detail on the mini specifications. So I'm just going to show you roughly how these work. There are several different mini specifications. For example purposes, I'm going to select my roof tiling mini spec. So once I've done that, I can then choose different types of roof tiling mini specs. So you see here that I've got some plain tile ones, some pan tile ones, some slate ones, and I've got a couple of custom ones that I've made. I've got my own pan tile one and a Marley Modern specific one. The way these are used is when you are creating your estimate and going through the estimate wizard, there's a screen which asks you which specification you want to choose, and it then asks you which mini spec you would like to use. The reason for this is that instead of you having to manually customize lots of sections of the specification to suit a modern tile roof, for example, we have a mini spec that's done it all for you. So if you were doing an expansion job and you were fitting modern tiles, you would select the mini spec which is a pan tile for an extension or renovation. What this will do is it will change all the lines in the main specification to all these figures here. So it will use, for example, a concrete interlocking low profile tile. It will have the correct fitting speed for that kind of tile. It will omit things like eaves tiles, tops tiles and verge tiles, because whilst they're fitted on old clays, they're not fitted on modern tiles. If I change this to choose a plain tile, this is the old-fashioned clays, you'll see that I've now got a plain clay tile, 60 a square metre. It takes longer to fit these, and now I have eaves tiles and tops tiles. And I can do the same for choosing a slate. So out of the box, there's several of these choices for each mini spec, but you can also make your own mini specifications. So you may notice here that I have a Marley Modern mini spec. And what I've done in there is I've actually just changed the concrete interlocking tile to specifically use a Marley Modern tile. So if you regularly work in an area where you're doing jobs with a Marley Modern or a Redland or a double Roman tile, for example, you can actually take our existing mini specs and make your own slightly tweaked versions, and you can make as many as you like. We have several new mini specs coming out soon, which includes fascia barge boards and soffits for sloped roofs and for flat roofs, and the new roof guttering mini specifications. And with the roof guttering, we have now a whole range of different types of plastic gutter systems with various sizes and downpipes, deep flow, cast iron, zinc, aluminium, cast aluminium, steel, etc. And again, it just means that you can do a little bit of pick and mix at the start of your estimate to choose bespoke products. This will save you time and reduce the amount of editing you've got to do in an estimate. We'll talk about that more when we look at Module 3, where we actually create an estimate for the first time. Okay, so that's the specification section finished. So just to reiterate, the importance of a specification is that it will take control of the selections in an estimate. So when you use a workbook, whilst you're in control of the dimensions of the data, so you will specify the lengths and the heights of a wall, the products that are being chosen is controlled by the specification. So if you take control of the specification, you take control of the data within the estimate. So now we're finished looking at the specification. Go to the top left hand corner and click on Close, and then click on Close again to return us to the Settings menu. So we're now going to have a look at a few more of the settings in here that you can customize to suit yourself. The first one we're going to look at is the profit and inflation. So there's a button here that says My Profit and Inflation, so click on that. And you'll see here you have two sections. These are the default values that you want these to be set at. So when you are creating an estimate through the new estimate wizard, there's a screen which will ask you what profit and what inflation you want to set. So if you don't want to have to keep typing 35%, then change these to whatever figures you would like to have at the start of your estimate. Now I'm setting mine all to the same figure. You can of course chop and change and make these higher and lower. The inflation will apply an inflationary value to your estimate after a certain length of time. This is optional when you are producing a quote. There is a button where you can switch this on or off. It does allow you to be very clever with your quote, and you can even tell your customer how clever you have been, thus increasing the accuracy of your quote to the customer, which can all go into the process of when you're selling to explain just how good your quote is. You've even taken inflation into account. If you don't want to use that function, then you don't need to change these settings. When you're creating the estimate, you can change them at that stage, and once you've actually made your estimate and you've done some estimating, you can still go in and change these profit and inflation figures. The idea of this screen is just to set up a default figure to what you normally want it to be set to. So once you've set these, click on OK to confirm. And the last section we're going to look at in this module is My Grouped Workbooks. So if you'd like to click on the My Grouped Works button, so these are preset lists of workbooks, calculators. The idea is that you can pick the preset group at the start of an estimate to give you an easy picking list to suit the type of job. This can be a lot easier than you manually selecting workbooks at the estimate creation stage. It's very easy for you to forget or miss workbooks. So what you'll see here is that across the top of each column is the title of each workbook group: house, bungalow, renovation, etc. Link to extension. So these are types of jobs. So when you are using the new estimate wizard, again we'll look at that in module 3, there's a screen which asks you what workbooks you would like to use or what group of workbooks you would like to use, so you can select one of these groups. Now out of the box you'll see that these lists are very big, and we do this on purpose. The reason being is that we'd like to give you a list that is very large, so if I scroll down here looking at the lean-to extension, with lots of choices. For example, we have several different PVC windows, several different bifold doors, lots of softwood Georgian bar windows, etc. Lots of possible costings that you will need on an extension. Okay, you're not going to use all of these, but the idea is if we put them all in a list, as you work your way down the list, you won't forget things. It will prompt you to estimate all the contents of the job. Now what that does mean is that you could have a list with 100 workbooks, and you will only be using typically 20 to 30 of those workbooks, so the lists can be quite large. Some people like to have the really big lists. Other people find that these can be a bit daunting, and once you've got an idea of the software, the things that you're typically estimating, and you've become comfortable with adding or removing workbooks from an estimate, you can start to fine-tune these lists to maybe get rid of some of the workbooks that you know you either never use or very rarely use. So if we use our lean-to extension group here as an example, let's say that in your area you never do dogtooth brickwork for whatever reason. So you don't want that in the lean-to extension group. You never use it and it's just getting in the way of looking at other workbooks. So what you can do is select the dogtooth brickwork, and on the top menu, or from right click, you can erase the workbook. It will ask you if you want to delete the workbook and you say yes. Now that's not removed the workbook from the software. All it has done is it has removed it from the group. And of course the opposite of this is if you find that every time you do a lean-to extension there's a particular workbook that you're always having to add into the estimate, you could add it into your list. To do this you click on Add Workbook, and this will show you all the workbooks which are not in the currently selected list. So it might be that quite often when you do extensions you do a lot of decoration at the same time. So you find that you're estimating complete room decoration. So we could tick complete room decoration and click on select, and it will then add it into this list. The other option we've got in here is we could then maneuver the position of where that workbook has been placed. Because I had the mouse cursor here, when I added the workbook, it placed it where the list had been selected. So if I want to move this a bit further down, I can click on this button that says Sort Workbooks, look for my complete room decoration, and I can move it down the list. Stick it further towards the bottom of the estimate. Once I've put it where I want it, I can click OK, and it has now jumped down the list. When you're adding a workbook, there are two ways that you can search for the type of workbook you're after. You could look at a workbook type. So if there's a particular decoration workbook that I'm looking for that's not in my list, I can click on decoration, and that will show me my decoration workbooks. It might be that I want to add the decorating plant workbook in, which has got various bits of equipment for decoration. Or it could be that I want to add roof decoration in, for example. I'll just clear that so I've not no selection there. I can also use a keyword. So if I know that I'm looking for a decoration workbook, I can maybe type in deco. And again, that will give me all the workbooks that have decoration in there. If I type in wall, it will show me all the workbooks that contain the word wall. When you use a keyword, don't press enter. If I just show you what happens when you do press enter, if I type in floor and press enter, it comes straight out of the Add Workbook screen, so just remember not to do that. If I want to look for floor workbook, click on Add Workbook, type in floor, and then just wait a moment for it to appear. And that will then show me all the floor workbooks which aren't in this list. Remember that when you see a workbook in this list, it's only here because it's not in the list you've got selected. You'll notice that architectural stone coins I've got here in my list. If I search for coins, okay, you'll notice it cannot find it. That's because any workbook that is in the list that's selected in the group cannot be found because it's not in this list anymore. So you can only add workbooks that are missing. So if you're looking for a workbook and you cannot find it in this screen, that means it is already in your list. The other thing you can do with this, once you can obviously modify an existing list, is you can actually make your own presets. So for example, I could make a preset list that's called Ed's Lean-To Extension. I might do that because I want to keep the HBXL original, but I want to make my own modified version because the HBXL original is suitable for some tasks, but there may be certain extensions I do in a particular style that I know exactly the sort of workbooks I want, and I'm always going to be using that. So I could make a copy of the Lean-To extension group by clicking on the copy column button, give it a name, so I'm going to call this Ed's Lean-To extension, and click OK. And you see that I've now got a new list here. I can now change this as much as I like, so that when I start an estimate I've got a choice of the default HBXL Lean-To group, or I've got my group which I've modified heavily. Obviously I haven't done that in this example, but you can then change this to be very, very specific. One thing to remember that when you do make very specific groups, it's up to you to remember anything that may be missed out. So as I started out with saying, our large groups are very large to help you not forget things. By working your way down the list, it should hopefully remind you of everything that you need to estimate. If you do make a very, very specific list, remember it's then up to you to make sure that you do remember everything that needs to be estimated. It's entirely up to you how much work you do with groups of workbooks. Some people like to make these very specific groups, as I just mentioned there. Other people like to stay with the big lists because it's better for reminding them. The best solution is whatever works best for you. So now we've done that, click on Close to return to the settings menu. You'll see that there are some other options on here, options like my bar charts and my reports. Okay. For this training course I'm not going to go into these in detail, but there are some videos and some FAQs on the HBXL support site which give you more information about how you can make your own custom bar charts and make your own custom reports. Okay, that is it for Module 2.